our speaker today is Dr. Jerry Taylor. Dr. Taylor is a professor in the College of Biblical Studies. He teaches in the Department of Bible, Missions, and Ministry. He's also a very highly thought of professor in our Doctor of Ministry program at ACU, where he brings his spiritual depth, his cultural wisdom together in conversations around public leadership and preaching. He's also, just this past year, has become the founding director for the Carl Spain Center on Race Studies and Spiritual Action. And in this new venue, Jerry is living out his deep and long commitment to drawing persons and communities together in the difficult work of racial reconciliation through spiritual practices, contemplation, communal dialogue. In addition to that kind of remote work, and the work that he does with students both inside and outside the classroom, Jerry travels widely across the country to college campuses, to congregational contexts. And so we're just so delighted that we could get on his schedule for him to be with us at this venue today. So I invite you to join with me in welcoming Dr. Taylor as he comes and speaks to us today on the long courage path.
It is with great gratitude that I express sincere appreciation to Dr. Carson Reed and the Siburt Institute for inviting me to speak to this gathering today. Thank you for entrusting such a noble task into my care. The mood of the nation is very somber as we stand in the midst of the major racial crisis. The last time we felt this type of acute national anxiety was during the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001. The multi-ethnic social cohesion of our democracy was severely tested. The country pulled together and remained as one nation even through the economic collapse of 2008. On the bleeding heels of 9/11 and the economic collapse of 2008 and the historic election of Barack Obama, foreign and domestic foes immediately began to undermine America's confidence in its first black president. They shrewdly associated President Obama's Middle Eastern-sounding name, Hussein, with Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. Some floated the idea that President Obama was a Muslim and was using the Oval Office to advance the interest of the Muslim world. This malicious narrative worked. A national survey by the Pew Research Center in 2010 found that nearly 1 in 5 Americans thought the president was a follower of Islam. 6 years later, the next presidential election brought into vogue the term white nationalism. Proponents of this philosophy spread their message across the political landscape with evangelistic fervor. But a mere 2 years later, while nationalists awoke the morning after the 2018 midterm elections to realize their worst political nightmare since the election of the first black president, the American voters decisively handed a political landslide to the most ethnically, gender, and religiously diverse U.S. Congress in the history of the nation. With immediate speed, the same forces that maliciously portrayed President Obama as being a Kenyan-born Muslim began to associate 4 congresswomen of color with the infamous legacy of the 19 dark-skinned images of the 9/11 hijackers. Political and religious forces are confident that this smear campaign remains a potent tactic today. This tactic is what I call assassination by association. It is when a politician subliminally associates his political opponents with known enemies of the state. Talk radio personalities also engage in the tactic of assassination by association. Angry words that travel across the airwaves of talk radio are destructive tools in the hands of those who traffic in fear, rage, and hostility. Talk radio has easy access to large audiences. Inside Radio reports that 58.8 million people listen to AM radio weekly. In light of our current state of severe racial tension, it is wise to remember the role that radio played in the lead-up to the Rwandan Genocide of 1994. It was in the aftermath of the assassination of the Rwandan president that talk radio escalated Hutu anxiety over the belief that the Tutsis would seize control of the government and would bring about a Hutu genocide. Radio RTLM incited ordinary citizens to take part in the massacres of 800,000 of their Tutsi and moderate Hutu neighbors. Mass killings incited through the use of this tool of mass communication were carried out despite the fact that nearly 90% of the country identified as Christian. It is said that Christian leaders and laypersons alike participated in the massacre of their neighbors only a few days after celebrating Easter. It was over RTLM that talk show hosts accused the Tutsis of not being Christians. They were therefore worthy of death. 25 years after the Rwandan genocide, white nationalists are instilling in Americans the same fear that drove the Hutus to viciously massacre their fellow citizens. The supersized fear of white genocide is on the menu of every white nationalist organization in America. It is important that we examine what the underlying fear of white nationalism looks like. Upon close examination, white nationalism is driven by the fear of the mongrelization of America. This fear needs to be exposed to the light of courage and of sound reasoning and of spiritual wisdom. George Wallace, the late governor of Alabama, was a Southern Democrat who ran for president of the United States in 1968. Wallace managed to successfully tap into the white nationalist sentiment through his political speeches given during the civil rights struggle over 50 years ago. Wallace said, "The citizens of these United States must join together to prevent the mongrelization of the white race." In a Huffington Post article entitled "Mongrelization of the White Race," David McElroy points out that while running on an unabashedly white is right platform, Wallace received the third most electoral college votes of any non-traditional presidential candidate in the history of the country. In addition to George Wallace, there was the late Mississippi U.S. Senator and white nationalist Theodore Bilbo, who for years occupied one of the highest political offices in the nation. Senator Bilbo laid out his doctrine of white nationalism in his book that was published in 1947, entitled Take Your Choice, Separation or Mongrelization. He believed that whites needed to go beyond mere segregation. He stressed that physical, geographical separation was the only way to preserve Western civilization and to conserve the white gene pool. Bilbo wrote, "If we choose any plan short of physical separation of the races, we are in effect adopting the scheme of blending of the races. Any student of racial history knows that if the Negroes remain in the United States, the last American will be an octoroon or a mongrel. If the Negroes are not removed, this condition may come about in 300 to 500 years. The fact that it will come sooner or later is a certainty." Shrewd politicians have sensed the bold emergence of white supremacist ideology into mainstream America. They now see overt racism as a winning strategy. Such opportunistic leaders affirm white fear, and they angrily articulate white rage in the hopes of winning the blind loyalty of a growing number of white nationalist converts in America's white majority. Since 2016, white nationalists have managed to saddle America's largest minority group with Wallace and Bilbo's fear of a mongrel America. Latinos comprise the largest minority in America today, about 35.1 million. Gregory Rodriguez wrote an article entitled Mongrel America, and he references a study conducted by the Population Research Center based in Portland, Oregon. The study projected as far back as 2003 that by the end of the 21st century, the number of Latinos claiming mixed ancestry would be more than 2 times the number claiming a single background. Fear of the influx of Mexicans into the United States has a long history in this country. John C. Box, representative of Texas in the late 1920s, warned his colleagues on the House Immigration and Naturalization Committee that the continued influx of Mexican immigrants could lead to the distressing process of mongrelization in America. He argued that because Mexicans were the products of mixing, they harbored a relaxed attitude toward interracial unions and were likely to mingle freely with other races in the United States. The political demonization of Mexicans and the Republican presidential primaries of 2016 seemed as an indirect attack on Columba Bush, Jeb Bush's wife, a Mexican-American born August 17, 1953, in Leon, Mexico. Jeb and Columba's interracial marriage symbolized the very thing that Wallace, Bilbo, and Box had condemned as a mongrel threat to the United States. In such an anti-Mexican climate, the notion of having a Mexican-American First Lady following directly on the heels of the first African-American First Lady would be too much for some Americans to endorse. The reaction to Jeb and Columba Bush reveals that some Americans value race more than they value a racially inclusive democratic society. There are those who believe that democracies work only in nations where white people are in the majority. Richard D. Farrell maintains that eventually democracies become troops of hyenas fighting over a dead carcass. And he states, the only solutions are a dictatorship. Farrell believes that the current form of democratic government must be abandoned in favor of a more authoritarian form of ruling that will suppress the political interest of minority groups. Farrell writes that white people must choose between racism and racial extinction. He maintains that if white people are going to survive as a race, then racism is the only option. The establishment of a collective dictatorship requires a point man that has the capacity to be dishonest, callous, deceptive, sadistic, narcissistic, violent, chaotic, ruthless, and rude enough to deconstruct a democratic society. According to a Congressional Research Service analysis in the last 2 years, 90% of those confirmed for appeals courts were white, 10% were Asian American, and none were African American, and none were Hispanic. In that same period, 92% of those confirmed as district court judges were white, 4% Asian American, 2% were African American, and 2% were Hispanic. This current judicial arrangement is reminiscent of South African apartheid, where a small white minority ruled a large black majority through legislative and judicial control. The racial stacking of the judicial system sends the wrong signal to our multiracial democracy. It signals that mostly white males will make the final judgment in terms of justice in a multiracial America. Maintaining this type of white control requires autocratic measures. A white dictatorship will see maintaining power as being more important than governing according to democratic anti-racist principles. These autocratic measures are being taken in reaction to the white fertility crisis. The fear of white extinction is truly understood when we consider the aging populations and the declining fertility rates in white homelands around the world. According to the World Population Review, the vast majority of countries in the world with the highest fertility rates are in Africa. Out of 200 countries in terms of the fertility rates, the United States is ranked at 142. There is a white fertility crisis that is going on in the world, and we must find the courage to discuss the ramifications of the statistical data with a spiritual approach. White supremacists are recruiting, training, and conditioning a generation of children for a violent reaction to the white fertility crisis. These children are now young adults that serve as foot soldiers in the white nationalist movement, who see it as their duty to do something about the growing number of black and brown people in this country. There is a growing number willing to kill their fellow citizens. This is clearly evident in the racist manifestos immediately released following recent mass shootings. These young men have been indoctrinated with the belief that a multiracial democratic society needs to be violently overthrown in order to ward off white extinction. In the June 27, 2019 issue of Hate Watch, Michael Edison Hayden wrote a shocking article entitled, "Far-Right Extremists Are Calling for Terrorism on the Messaging App Telegram." According to Hayden, Hate Watch examined publicly visible posts on the messaging app in which channel moderators urged their followers to destabilize the United States, to kill cops, shoot lawmakers, and attack synagogues, mosques, and other houses of worship. James Mason, in his book entitled Siege, also encourages his readers to embrace terrorism in the name of destabilizing Western countries, which he believed will give rise to a new country for white-only non-Jews. Mason writes in his book, "We don't want to hurt the system, we want to kill it." Paul Nealon, a former GOP candidate for U.S. Congress from Wisconsin, has become one of the high-profile advocates of terrorism in America today. According to Hate Watch, Nealon is also an outspoken proponent of what is known as accelerationism. Accelerationism is the idea that Western civilization must be pushed to collapse through acts of violence in order to bring about a non-Jewish, all-white country. Civic bonds between citizens in this country are being broken along ethnic lines, and it will take a major economic crisis to ignite these racial divisions into a burning inferno. We are in a very critical place in our country. Alan Greenspan and Alvin Toffler, in their writings, both speak of America's vulnerability in terms of racial hostilities in the face of imminent global economic changes that will come. Alan Greenspan served as chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, whose chairmanship continued through the administrations of 4 American presidents. In his book published in 2008, entitled The Age of Turbulence, Adventures in a New World, he spoke prophetically about the current state we're in today. He explained how the economic power shift in the global economy would add tremendous stress to the nation's social fabric. Greenspan points out that some believe that the global economy has grown too large and too interdependent, that the old means of regulating trade and commerce across national boundaries are no longer effective. Because many national economies have turned to free trade and free market capitalism, we now have an innumerable amount of transnational corporations and international companies. And some of these corporations are more powerful and economically viable than some national economies. Alvin Toffler, who advised the Reagan administration in his book Power Shift, published in 1990, he wrote, "New knowledge has overturned the world we once knew and shaken the pillars of power that held it in place. Surveying the wreckage," he says, "ready once more to create a new civilization, we stand all together now at ground zero." James Cruppy, president of the Dallas-based International Leadership Center, points out how racially and politically volatile we are as a nation in light of the ongoing global economic shift. He says, "You make a serious error if you look at the United States as an entity. Different parts of the United States are as different as night and day." He suggests that the United States is on its way to becoming a nation of city-states. Cruppy believes that as regions and localities take on their own cultural, technological, and political character, it will be harder for governments to manage economies with the traditional tools of central bank regulation, taxation, and financial controls. On December 29, 2008, a disturbing article appeared in the Wall Street Journal with the title, "As if Things Weren't Bad Enough, Russian Professor Predicts End of the United States." Russian academic Igor Panarin is a former KGB analyst and dean of Russian Foreign Ministry's Academy for Future Diplomats. He has appeared frequently in the Russian media as an expert on U.S.-Russian relations. He has been a top expert in information warfare and has taught many high-ranking officials that now operate in the Kremlin. The professor listed several things that would lead to the collapse of the United States. Panarin predicted that mass immigration, the collapse of the dollar, an economic and moral collapse, he said, would trigger a civil war and the eventual collapse and breakup of the United States. He predicted that when the going gets tough, wealthier states would withhold funds from the federal government and effectively secede from the Union. He said that once the United States split along ethnic lines, foreign powers will move in to divide up the spoils. Panarin's apocalyptic portrait will most likely come true if racism is allowed to continue to drive a wedge between white people and people of color in this country. In order to prevent this prediction from becoming true, all Americans must recommit to seeking to be a good nation instead of arrogantly boasting of being the greatest nation. A good nation exercises its great power with compassion, justice, righteousness, and measured restraint abroad as well as at home. A nation driven to be the greatest will eventually use its great power to oppress and exploit the poorest and the most vulnerable in its midst. Today, we need America to be good. In the spirit of those Africans that rode the uneasy Atlantic waters, and the immortal voice of Martin Luther King Jr., and in the voices of the founding fathers of this democratic experiment, we cry aloud today, declaring that we still hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal and are endowed by their divine Creator with certain inalienable rights. It is with this zealous hope that we urgently appeal to all white Christians in America to reject the white nationalist agenda, resist political leaders that use racism as a winning strategy to seduce sincere people to join their mission of racial division, resist professional confidence men that are bewitching the masses with a deceptive tongue trained in trickery. In this historic watershed moment, the survival of our democracy resides primarily in the hands of America's white majority. If our nation is permitted to die on your watch, you will be known as the generation that held the cloaks of dishonest men as they stoned to death the dream of a better America. Break your silence. Your silence will betray the future of your unborn descendants and will cause Christianity to be judged as spiritually bankrupt. Your continued support of political leaders that contradict the moral teachings of Jesus is a hypocrisy that must be immediately abandoned. Rwanda taught us about the atrocities that will happen when the Christian church quietly looks the other way. In Christianity and Genocide in Rwanda, Timothy Longman explains both how and why Christians became involved in the 1994 genocide. He examines the ways that Rwanda's churches politicized ethnicity, supported autocratic and discriminatory governments, and promoted obedience and acquiescence to Rwanda's political institutions. Longman points out that Rwanda's churches failed to provide any credible opposition to the waves of violence that occurred against Rwanda's Tutsis in 1959, 1965, and 1973, despite being directly affected by it. In each instance, Rwanda's churches and Christian leaders failed to condemn the violence. Longman concludes that as a result, Rwanda's Christian leaders cultivated an atmosphere where good practicing Christians could kill their neighbors without feeling that they were acting inconsistently with their faith. We say to white Christians that your inaction in this current hour of moral crisis will bequeath to your grandchildren a nation that will be ruled by tyrants and despotic dictators. Remember that the evil you tolerate today will have increased 100-fold before tomorrow's sunset. During the first century in the Roman Empire, Christians were persecuted because they refused to participate in emperor cult worship. And as in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, Christians today must decide whether we will bow down and worship to human kings or be willing to face the fire in the furnace of social and political rejection. In 1968, a white assassin's bullet fatally shot Black Hope in the neck as it stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. But 40 years later, Black Hope found the audacity to hope again as the Black senator from the land of Lincoln was sworn in as the President of the United States in the shadows of the Lincoln Monument. It is in the spirit of this indestructible hope that we call upon white Christians in America to renew a collective will to rise above the rhetoric of hatred being preached in the campaigns of bigotry. The voice of divinity, though it speaks in a whisper, reminds us that no mere dictator or tyrant should ever be the central focus of our human adoration and our human worship. There is another who is higher, greater, and wiser, who stands center stage in the unfolding human drama. It is the divine creator who dictates the future, not one man, not one political party, and not one race. The founding fathers knew that if the American people remained consciously aware of their own dignity as human beings created in the image of God, then the dictators of the world would lose their power to intimidate, manipulate, seduce, divide, and dominate. The divine creator keeps the inner region of the soul of a nation from being compromised by tyrannical lies, bullying threats, nepotistic power grabs, and the covert corruption of dishonest men. White Christians in America, this is the historic moment that you must decide on which side of history you will stand. The moment is urgent and the hour is critical. And we all, as Christians, must stand, speak, and act with the courage of the living Christ that dwells within us. May God bless us with the courage to keep our eyes on God and keep our allegiance committed to a kingdom that is not of this world, and to remind us that this world is not our home and our skin is not eternal, because in the grave all skeletons look alike.